She thought my pool was hers, but her outrageous schemes and wild accusations led to a shocking end. You won't believe what happened next. A jarring splash shattered the Tuesday morning quiet. My heart pounded against my ribs. Splashing in my pool? I lived alone. A cold dread seeped into my bones. As I crept to the sliding door, coffee mug clutched tight. What I saw made me gasp, nearly spilling hot coffee all over myself. A middle-aged woman, serene as a queen, lazily floating on my inflatable raft. Was I dreaming? Was this some bizarre, unwelcome hallucination? She wore a wide, floppy hat, oversized sunglasses, and casually sipped from what looked suspiciously like a mimosa in a plastic cup. At 7 in the morning, for a fleeting second, I wondered if I'd finally lost my mind. Had I forgotten to lock the gate? Was this a lost, tipsy tourist? No. The arrogant voice that drifted across the shimmering water confirmed my worst fears. She glanced up, a dismissive wave of her hand, as if I were her personal servant. "Oh, good, you're awake," she chirped. "You really should put out more towels for guests." Guests? She called herself a guest in my own pool at dawn, without a shred of invitation or shame. My blood ran cold, then boiled. I stepped outside, letting the screen door bang shut, a stark punctuation to my fury. "Do you realize this is private property?" I demanded, my voice cutting like ice. She actually laughed, a bright, tinkling sound, as if I just delivered the funniest joke. "Don't be silly. Pools in this neighborhood are meant to be shared. Everyone knows that." She swept her hand grandly towards the sky, as if her personal delusion was some universal decree. I'd weathered my share of bizarre encounters in this suburban paradise, but this was a new peak of audacity. Most people, when caught trespassing, at least blush and scramble. Not this woman, this Karen. She just leaned further back, stretching languidly. "Besides," she purred, "it's far too hot not to swim." Her entitlement was so monumental, so utterly fearless. It almost commanded a twisted sort of respect. Almost. What she didn't know was that I wasn't truly alone. My friend, Officer Ben Carter, the county sheriff, had spent the night after we'd grilled steaks and traded fishing stories. Ben wasn't a man who needed to flash his badge. His authority was a natural aura, like the quiet calm before a storm. Just then I heard the back door slide open again. There he stood, a towel slung over his shoulder, already in his swim trunks. He blinked, surveying the bizarre scene, then looked at me. "Morning," he deadpanned, his voice flat. "Did you forget to tell me you opened a public swimming hole?" Karen froze, mid-sip. Her plastic cup wobbled, a tiny tremor in her hand. Her eyes blinked once, twice, as if her brain was rebooting. You're the sheriff?" Her voice, stripped bare of its false bravado, cracked pitifully. Ben simply raised an eyebrow, a silent question, and began to walk towards the pool. He didn't shout. He didn't posture. He just stepped into the shallow end with a quiet, unshakable confidence that made guilty people confess before you even asked. I leaned against the railing, savoring every delicious second. "Karen," I said, a sweet, deceptive smile on my face. "This is Officer Carter. Officer Carter, this is Karen. She seems to think my pool is some sort of public water fountain, but with floaties." Karen sputtered, sitting up so fast the raft nearly flipped. I was just cooling off. "It's not a big deal. Everyone does it." Officer Carter gave her a look so utterly flat it could press flowers. "Everyone?" he asked, his voice soft, yet chilling. "Or just you?" Her lips compressed into a thin white line. I could almost see the frantic calculations in her mind. She desperately wanted to cling to her imagined right, her fabricated claim to my property, but with the sheriff standing waist-deep, her confidence was dissolving faster than cheap sunscreen. Still, she tried to recover. "Well, technically, the HOA rules." She stumbled, the words dying in her throat. It was clear she hadn't read the bylaws. She just assumed her self-proclaimed authority meant she could warp reality. Officer Carter cut her off, his tone firm. Ma'am, unless those rules include trespassing as a recommended activity, I suggest you get out. The silence that followed was golden. Karen squirmed on the raft, clearly torn between defiance and obedience. I couldn't resist twisting the knife. Would you like me to grab you a towel? I asked, my voice dripping with false sweetness. Or should I call the HOA president and let him know you're spearheading a new pool-sharing program? Karen shot me a glare that could peel paint, but under Officer Carter's unwavering gaze, she finally swung her legs over the side and sloshed to the steps. Her exit was anything but graceful. Her floppy hat slipped over her eyes. The mimosa sloshed onto the deck, and by the time she stormed past me, she looked less like a glamorous pool queen and more like a drowned rat. She muttered something about unneighborly behavior and going to the board, but the power had drained from her words. She was retreating, and she knew it. When the gate finally clanged shut, I turned back to Ben, who was floating on his back in the deep end, utterly unbothered. You know, I mused, I'm starting to think inviting you over was the smartest decision I've made all year. He chuckled, eyes closed, a faint smile on his lips. Glad to be of service. Though you might want to install a camera back here. I have a feeling she's not done with you. He was right. That was only the beginning. If I'd learned anything living in this HOA-controlled neighborhood, it was this. When you embarrass Karen, she doesn't just lick her wounds, she plots. And sure enough, the very next morning, the first retaliatory strike landed in my mailbox. The envelope looked official enough to send a jolt of anxiety through me. Crisp white, stamped with the HOA logo, addressed in that stiff mechanical font that screamed bureaucratic nonsense. I knew, even before tearing it open, that this was Karen's venomous handiwork. The woman had barely dried off from her unsolicited swim before deciding vengeance should be mailed directly to my front door. Coffee in one hand, envelope in the other, I ripped it open. A violation notice. My pool, according to the HOA, was out of compliance with community standards, citing unauthorized visitors, unsafe access, and even failure to provide a shared amenity in good faith. I nearly choked on my coffee, laughing. In what universe was I obligated to share my private pool like a public park bench? But the ultimate insult was the fine, $500. They wanted me to pay $500 because Karen had broken into my yard. I sat at the kitchen table, the absurd letter spread before me, savoring the sheer ridiculousness. Ben, who had stayed over again, wandered in, half asleep, his hair sticking up like he'd been electrocuted. He squinted at the paper, then frowned. Already? He mumbled. I slid it over. He read it silently, his expression shifting from mild annoyance to pure disbelief. They're fining you for her trespassing. I nodded, a wry smile on my face. Yep, apparently I'm guilty of having a pool in her line of sight. Ben rubbed his temples, a sigh escaping him. This is harassment. Plain and simple, he stated, his voice now fully awake. She's trying to use the HOA to cover her tracks. He wasn't wrong. Karen wasn't stupid, just utterly entitled. She knew that if she cloaked her vendetta in the language of community regulations, she could weaponize the HOA board against me. By noon, I got my second taste of Karen's campaign. A bright orange notice taped to my fence. Violation pending review. Access must be provided. My sarcastic brain instantly translated. Karen wants her pool day back. It was ridiculous, yes, but also genuinely dangerous. The HOA's power to fine and even place lanes on properties was terrifyingly real. That was the insidious trick with people like Karen. They hid behind procedure, counting on the rest of us to roll over rather than fight. That evening, Ben and I sat on the back porch, grilling again. He leaned forward, his voice low, deliberate. She's making this official, Alex. You need to respond the same way. No sarcasm, no ignoring it. Paper trail, counter complaints, the works. I didn't relish playing HOA politics, but I certainly wasn't about to write a $500 check for Karen's arrogance. So I drafted a formal response, citing trespassing laws, Ben's witness testimony, and a gentle reminder that HOA rules absolutely do not override property rights. I hand-delivered copies to every board member's mailbox, just to ensure they couldn't conveniently get lost. Karen, predictably, escalated. The very next day she was in the cul-de-sac with 2 other board members, clipboard in hand, gesturing wildly towards my property. I kept my distance, but snippets drifted over. Uncooperative, safety hazard, sets a bad precedent. I half expected her to accuse me of running an underground water park. When she spotted me watching from my driveway, she snapped her head around, a smug, cat-like smirk on her face. The board scheduled a hearing for Friday evening, a kangaroo court, essentially, where neighbors would gather to watch the board pretend to be judges. Ben offered to attend, but I assured him I could handle it. What I didn't tell him was the ace I had up my sleeve. Karen didn't know the HOA's bylaws had recently been updated. While I usually ignored their petty rules, I'd read every single page the night I moved in, wanting to know what weapons they thought they possessed. It turned out one clause specifically forbade the HOA from enforcing rules on private property amenities, unless a safety hazard was involved, and there were none. Friday arrived swiftly. The hearing was held in the community center, a beige room that always smelled faintly of stale coffee and quiet desperation. Folding chairs faced a long table where the board sat, with Karen enthroned in the middle, like a queen. She was dressed for the part too. Crisp blouse, heavy necklace, hair sprayed into an unyielding defiance. She began speaking before anyone had even settled. We're here to address the blatant disregard for community standards exhibited by Mr. Miller, she boomed, her voice echoing. I let her talk. She loved the sound of her own outrage, and the more rope she had, the better. She ranted about my pool not being inclusive, how neighbors felt unwelcome, and even accused me of creating hostility. The sheer audacity of it left me stunned. When she finally paused for breath, I stood calmly. May I respond? The board chair, an older man who clearly just wanted to get back to his evening TV, nodded wearily. I laid out the cold hard facts. Karen trespassed. Officer Carter witnessed it. The HOA cannot dictate the use of private property, unless safety issues exist, which they absolutely did not. I even pulled out a highlighted copy of the bylaws, sliding it across the table. The room grew eerily quiet. Karen's eyes narrowed. She hadn't expected me to come armed with their own rules, but she wasn't going down without a fight. You're twisting the language, she snapped, her voice cracking on the word spirit, as if even her vocal cords didn't buy her act. It's about the spirit of community. That's when I dropped the hammer. If this board chooses to fine me for someone else's illegal trespassing, I stated, my voice ringing with quiet authority, I'll have no choice but to involve county law enforcement and pursue damages. That got their attention. A murmur rippled through the audience. No one wanted to be dragged into a lawsuit, especially with the county sheriff himself potentially testifying. The board chair leaned back, clearly exasperated. We'll take this under advisement, he said flatly. Bureaucrats speak for Karen. Drop it before we all get sued. Karen tried to salvage what dignity she had left by storming out, muttering about calling a higher authority. I watched her go, resisting the urge to clap. Back home, Ben was waiting with a beer. How'd it go? He asked. I smirked. Let's just say I quoted scripture, their scripture, and Karen hated every single word, but Ben wasn't smiling. He leaned forward, serious now. She's not going to stop, Alex. You embarrassed her in front of the board. She's going to come back harder. I knew he was right. For people like Karen, it was never about rules or fairness. It was about control. And when you strip away their control, they don't quit, they escalate. Sure enough, the very next morning, a new sound woke me. Construction. A generator hummed. Tools clattered. I peered outside and nearly dropped my coffee. Karen had hired workers. In my yard, they were building something on my fence. When I first heard the buzzing, I thought a neighbor was power washing their driveway. But seeing 3 men in neon vests hammering into my fence, I realized the chaos had landed squarely in my backyard. Karen stood there, arms crossed, clipboard in hand, looking like a foreman on a job she wasn't paying for. The sheer gall was breathtaking. Morning. I called down, keeping my voice calm, almost cheerful. Quick question. Which one of you fine gentlemen plans on explaining why you're building something on property that doesn't belong to you? The workers froze, hammers mid-swing. Karen spun around, her face already flushed, and barked, "Don't listen to him, he's obstructing an HOA project." I descended the stairs slowly, coffee mug still in hand, as if I had all the time in the world. "An HOA project on my fence?" I asked, feigning innocent surprise. Karen straightened, tapping her clipboard for emphasis. "Yes, as per board approval, we're installing a safety gate to provide community access to the pool." She declared it like gospel. My pool, my private pool, and she was trying to turn it into a neighborhood amenity by pure brute force. The workers, caught in this bizarre crossfire, looked uneasy. One finally spoke up. "Ma'am, are you sure this is the right property? The paperwork just says community access installation." Karen waved him off dismissively. "Yes, this is the one. I'm on the board. It's authorized." She glanced at me smugly, daring me to challenge her. I took a slow, deliberate sip of coffee, savoring the moment. "Gentlemen," I said, my voice quiet but firm, "before you drill another hole in that fence, you should know two things. First, this is private property, not common ground, not community space. It's mine." Their eyes widened. "Second," I continued, "the county sheriff lives 10 minutes away. He's a very good friend of mine. Would you like me to call him so we can all clarify whether this project is legal?" That did. The workers exchanged nervous glances, set down their tools, and muttered about needing to double-check paperwork. Karen lunged forward, like a general losing her troops. "No, keep working. Don't listen to him. He's lying." But it was too late. They were already packing up. One even tipped his hard hat politely at me before heading out. Karen's face turned a dangerous shade of crimson. "You're sabotaging community improvements," she hissed. I chuckled. "Karen, the only thing I'm sabotaging is your dream of turning my backyard into the neighborhood YMCA." She pointed a trembling finger at me, clipboard shaking. "This isn't over," she snapped before storming off. She was right. It wasn't over. That afternoon, another letter arrived. Not a violation notice this time, but a cease and desist, drafted in dramatic mangled legalese. According to Karen, my refusal to allow the construction was a violation of community cooperative standards. It was absurd, of course, but the fact that she'd typed it up and slid it into an official-looking envelope told me she was digging in for war. Ben came by that evening, and I showed him the letter. He read it twice, then burst out laughing. "She actually wrote this herself?" he guffawed, pointing at the nonsensical jargon. "Half these phrases don't even mean anything." I shrugged. "Still, she's determined, and determined people with clipboards are dangerous." He leaned back in his chair, thoughtful. "She's escalating because she lost twice. Once at the pool, once at the board meeting. People like her don't handle public embarrassment well. They try to win by volume instead of logic." He paused. "But this trespassing and unauthorized construction, Alex, that's real ground to stand on." The next day, Karen switched tactics. If she couldn't force her way into my yard, she'd wage war from the outside. By mid-morning, I saw fresh signs taped to the neighborhood bulletin board, and even staked into a few lawns. "Community pool access denied by selfish neighbor." My address wasn't printed, but the arrow pointing straight at my house made the target painfully clear. Kids rode past on bikes, pointing. Neighbors slowed their walks, staring. Karen herself stood on the sidewalk with a stack of flyers, handing them out like a political campaigner. "He's trying to hoard resources," she told anyone who'd listen. "We're all paying HOA dues, and he's keeping the pool to himself." I stood on my porch, arms folded, watching the spectacle. It was pure theater, and Karen was performing at full volume. I knew I had to be careful. If I confronted her directly, she'd twist it into proof of my hostility. So instead, I documented everything. Photos of the signs, videos of her impassioned speeches, copies of her ridiculous flyers. Ben, when I showed him, just shook his head. "She's making your case stronger, Alex. Keep letting her dig." By Thursday, Karen escalated again. This time, she called a special emergency HOA meeting in the community center. The notice was slipped under every door: urgent discussion of shared pool access and community fairness. It was glaringly obvious what the agenda was. Against my better judgment, not because I thought logic would prevail, but because I refused to let her control the narrative uncontested. The room was packed, neighbors filled folding chairs, murmuring as Karen stood at the front, clipboard in hand. As always, she launched into a fiery speech about equity and neighbors banding together against selfishness. She painted me as the villain, hoarding luxury while everyone else suffered in the heat. It was laughable, but her passion was convincing enough that a few people nodded along. When she finally opened the floor, I stood. First, let's clear one thing up, I began, my voice clear and steady. My pool is private property, not common ground, not maintained by HOA funds, not listed in the bylaws. It's mine. Karen knows this, but she's trying to spin a story to the contrary. I pulled out the highlighted bylaws again, handing copies to the audience. Nowhere does it obligate any homeowner to share private amenities. A ripple went through the crowd as people read. Karen tried to interrupt, but I raised my voice just enough to cut over. Second, let's talk about what actually happened. Karen trespassed into my pool without permission. The county sheriff personally witnessed it. Then she tried to hire workers to break into my property and build a gate. That is illegal, not a gray area. Illegal. Silent. You could hear the air conditioner wheezing in the ceiling. Karen's face went pale, but she scrambled anyway. He's twisting the facts. I was making improvements for the community, but her words rang hollow. People shifted uncomfortably, a dawning realization on their faces that they'd been duped. Then came the twist I hadn't expected. A man in the back stood up, a neighbor I didn't know well, middle-aged, quiet. Karen, he said slowly, deliberately, last summer, you swam in my pool when we were out of town. Our neighbor caught you on camera. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Another woman chimed in. She used our hot tub too, claimed she was checking for safety. Suddenly, the narrative flipped. Karen wasn't just targeting me. She had a history. The community turned on her in real time. Murmurs growing louder, eyes darting towards her like a predator surrounded. She stammered, clutching her clipboard like a life preserver. That's not, you're twisting. But the tide had shifted. The blue and red lights bouncing off my living room wall were the kind of wake-up call that makes your stomach drop. I threw on a shirt and stepped outside to find 2 squad cars parked at the curb. Neighbors huddled, like it was the premiere of some reality TV show. And in the middle of it all stood Karen, arms crossed, a smug grin plastered on her face, speaking animatedly to one of the officers. When she saw me, her voice rose theatrically. There he is. That's the man running an unlicensed public pool business. The crowd murmured. Some shook their heads. Others leaned closer, eager for drama. I pinched the bridge of my nose. It was 7:00 in the morning, and Karen had somehow escalated from trespassing to accusing me of running an underground water park cartel. The officer approached me, his expression neutral, but wary. Sir, we've received a report that you're operating your pool as a business, charging admission without permits. We need to ask you a few questions. Karen's smirk widened. She was practically glowing with victory. I forced myself to stay calm, even managing a touch of amusement. Of course, officer. Please ask away. Though I should warn you, this is going to be disappointing. I gestured toward the backyard gate. Would you like to see my bustling empire of pool memberships and overpriced snacks? The officer blinked, thrown off by my sarcasm, but nodded. A small procession followed me, the officer, Karen glued to his elbow, and half the neighborhood trailing like nosy ducklings. We reached the pool, glistening in the morning sun, serene, and most importantly empty. No resort-style lounge chairs, no ticket booth, no cash box, just water, deck chairs, and a lone flamingo floaty. I swept an arm across the scene. Behold my illegal operation, I announced, deadpan. As you can see, the rush hour crowd is simply overwhelming. A ripple of laughter ran through the neighbors. Even the officer cracked a smile. Karen, however, turned crimson. He must have hidden the evidence, she sputtered. He probably takes it all down at night. I've seen strangers here. I know it. The officer raised an eyebrow. Do you have proof of that, ma'am? Photos, records, witnesses? Karen faltered. Well, no, but I know what I saw. At that exact moment, the sliding glass door opened, and out walked Ben, in his full uniform, badge gleaming, sidearm holstered, every inch the picture of authority. He stopped short, taking in the scene. Morning, he said flatly.
Why is half the neighborhood in my friend's backyard? Karen's jaw dropped. She hadn't expected him. The officer stiffened, recognizing him immediately. Sheriff Carter, he said, nodding respectively. Ben looked from the officer to Karen to me. Let me guess, he said, a weary sigh in his voice. Another complaint? I didn't even need to answer. Karen was already stammering. Sure, Sheriff, I was just... Ben cut her off with a look so sharp it could slice glass. Ma'am, you've been warned about trespassing, and now you've made a false report of a crime. Do you understand how serious that is? The murmurs in the crowd grew louder. The officer, who'd been questioning me, cleared his throat. Sheriff, we'll wrap this up. Seems like a misunderstanding. Ben didn't take his eyes off Karen. It's not a misunderstanding when someone abuses police resources to harass a neighbor. That's filing a false report. You want me to take her in? Or do you want to handle the paperwork? Karen froze, cornered between utter humiliation and the threat of handcuffs. The smugness drained from her face like water down a drain. I was just trying to uphold community standards, she mumbled weakly. Ben shook his head. Community standards don't override the law. You've been warned. Do not call my officers again, unless you have actual evidence of a crime. Otherwise, the next ride you take will be in the back of a cruiser. The crowd dispersed slowly, neighbors whispering, some openly shaking their heads at Karen. She tried to salvage dignity by storming off, but the damage was done. Her credibility had shattered in front of half the subdivision. Inside, Ben collapsed into a chair, exhaling hard. She's losing control, Alex. This was her big play, getting you tangled with law enforcement. Now it's blown up in her face. I poured him coffee, shaking my head. She's relentless. Normal people get embarrassed and stop. She doubles down. He nodded grimly. And that makes her dangerous, because now it's not just about you, it's about her pride. She'll scorch the earth before she admits she's wrong. That night, I learned exactly what he meant. I was sitting in the living room when I heard a faint splash outside. My stomach sank. I grabbed a flashlight, stepped onto the deck, and sure enough, there she was. Karen, in my pool again. At midnight, she froze in the beam of my light, looking like a raccoon caught in a trash can. Her hair clung wet to her face, her breathing ragged. She looked less like a smug HOA tyrant, and more like a desperate woman, clinging to the last shreds of her control. What are you doing? I asked, my voice steady, edged with steel. She stammered. I needed to prove it's not just for you. It's supposed to be shared. Her words were jumbled, frantic, as if she were trying to convince herself as much as me. I didn't yell. I didn't threaten. I just pulled out my phone and held it up. The screen glowed, recording every second. Karen, I said softly, you've now trespassed twice. You've filed false reports. You've harassed me with fake fines. And now you're breaking and entering. How long do you think the HOA will protect you when I bring this to them? Her eyes widened, the reality finally sinking in. She scrambled out of the pool, dripping and shivering, and bolted into the night, without another word. The next morning, I delivered the footage, straight to the HOA board. I didn't sugarcoat it. This is your board member, I said, sliding my phone across the table. This is what she's doing at midnight, on my property. The room went silent, as the video played. The splash, the flashlight beam, Karen's panicked face. When it ended, the board chair cleared his throat, awkwardly. We will need to review this. Karen wasn't present at that meeting. In fact, she went conspicuously silent. For the next 2 days, no flyers, no letters, no speeches, just a profound, unsettling quiet. The neighborhood buzzed with speculation. Had she finally been reined in? Was she suspended? Or was she plotting something even bigger? Ben, ever the realist, had the answer. She's not done, he said, sipping his beer on my porch. She's quiet, because she's planning. You've boxed her in legally, and she knows it. So she's going to make her move outside the system. He was right again, because the very next weekend, I woke to chaos. Sirens, flashing lights, and the unmistakable smell of smoke. I ran outside, to find fire trucks in front of Karen's house. Neighbors gathered, whispering, pointing, and then I saw it. Her garage, scorched black, smoke pouring out. As I stood there stunned, 2 realizations hit me at once. First, Karen had just lost far more than any argument could ever win her. And second, before the day was over, she was going to find a way to blame me. The smoke rolled thick and bitter into the morning air, curling above the cul-de-sac like an ominous banner. Neighbors clustered in bathrobes and slippers, whispering with wide eyes, as firefighters battled the blaze, devouring Karen's garage. I stood on my lawn, arms folded, still groggy, but sharp enough to feel the dread creeping up my spine. I knew before she even opened her mouth what was coming. Karen stood in the street, hair wild, face streaked with smoke and sweat, screaming over the roar of the sirens. He did this. He set the fire. He's been threatening me for weeks. Her finger shot towards me like a weapon, trembling but determined. Every head in the crowd turned in my direction. This was the accusation she had been waiting to hurl, the nuclear option in her war for control. I stayed, rooted, calm, though my pulse hammered. The firefighter captain, peeling off his mask, approached Karen. "Ma'am, we don't know the cause yet. It's too early," she shrieked. "It's obvious. He hates me. He wants me gone." The captain gave her a look that said he'd heard enough wild accusations for one morning, but the seed was planted. Half the neighborhood stared at me as if I had a box of matches in my pocket. Ben arrived minutes later, cruiser lights flashing. He strode through the crowd with that same storm cloud authority, stopping beside me. "What happened?" he asked quietly. "Garage fire," I said, and she's already pointing the finger.
Karen lunged towards him, grabbing his arm. "Arrest him. You saw how he threatened me. You know he hates me." Her voice cracked into hysteria. Ben pulled free, holding her at arm's length. "Ma'am, unless you have evidence, accusing someone of arson is a serious claim. Do you have proof?" she faltered, eyes darting, but her mouth kept moving. He filmed me. He's obsessed. He wanted revenge." Ben looked at me, then at her, then back at the burning garage. "We'll investigate," he said firmly. "But until we know what caused this fire, no one is getting arrested. Understood?" Karen's face twisted, torn between pure rage and desperate fear. She turned away, muttering about conspiracies and vendettas, her body shaking as much from fury as from shock. The fire was contained by mid-morning, leaving the garage a hollow, charred skeleton. Rumors spread like wildfire of their own. Some swore they'd seen sparks from faulty wiring. Others whispered about gasoline cans. By noon, the neighborhood was a pressure cooker of gossip, with Karen's accusations hanging heavy in the air. That afternoon, Ben came by my house, looking more tired than usual. "You're not going to like this, Alex," he said, sitting heavily at my kitchen table. "She filed an official complaint, says you harassed her, threatened her, and now retaliated by burning down her garage." I poured him coffee, letting the sheer absurdity settle. "Do I at least get points for creativity?" I mused. "I mean, arson as revenge? It's dramatic, almost flattering." Ben wasn't smiling. "The department has to take it seriously, which means they'll interview you. Don't panic. It's protocol." "But she's playing this like a chess game, and she just moved her queen." I nodded, already thinking 3 steps ahead. "If she wants to drag me into legal mud, then I'll wade in with both boots. But I'm not going to get dirty. She is." The interview was brief. 2 officers sat in my living room, polite but pointed, asking about my whereabouts, my relationship with Karen, whether we'd had conflicts. I answered everything calmly, even sarcastically at times, handing them a neat file I'd already prepared. Photos of Karen trespassing, video of her midnight swim, copies of her fake fines, and records of her false police report. By the time they left, one officer muttered, "Honestly, she looks more like the suspect than you." But Karen wasn't done. The very next day, she held what could only be described as a press conference on her lawn. She stood in front of her charred garage, clipboard in hand, as always, speaking to anyone who'd listen. "This is what happens when bullies are allowed to run free," she cried, her voice cracking. "I've been targeted, harassed, and now my property has been destroyed. Is this the kind of community we want to live in?" Neighbors shifted uneasily, some nodded sympathetically, others rolled their eyes. I watched from my porch, sipping iced tea, resisting the urge to heckle. It was pure theater, But theater has power when people are desperate to believe the drama. That evening Ben came over again, this time with a thick folder. He slapped it on my counter. Preliminary report, he announced. Electrical fire, faulty wiring in her garage, no accelerant, no sign of arson, case closed. Relief washed through me. A profound cleansing wave, but it was bittersweet. Facts don't always matter when someone is determined to play the victim. Sure enough, Karen doubled down. Even after the official ruling, she insisted it was a cover-up. Of course they'd protect him, she told anyone who'd listen. He's friends with the sheriff. It's all corruption. Her paranoia was spreading, infecting her credibility even further. The same neighbors who once nodded along now crossed the street to avoid her. And then came the twist none of us saw coming. At the next HOA board meeting, the chair cleared his throat nervously before speaking. Effective immediately, he announced, his voice trembling slightly. Karen has been removed from the board for misconduct and abuse of authority. Gasps filled the room. Karen, seated in the front row, shot up like a rocket. You can't do this. I am the board. But the decision was final. Her antics, her lies, her midnight swims, they had finally caught up with her. I sat in the back, silent, savoring every second. Watching her storm out, without her beloved clipboard, was like watching a dethroned monarch, stripped of her crown and her last vestige of power. For the first time the neighborhood exhaled, a collective sigh of relief. People actually clapped. But Karen's final, most poignant act was still waiting in the wings. 2 nights later, I woke to the soft sound of splashing again. My heart pounded, a familiar dread coiling in my stomach. I crept to the deck, flashlight in hand. I half expected to find her back in the pool, desperate to reclaim her imaginary kingdom. Instead, I found her standing at the very edge, staring into the dark water, shoulders slumped, her clipboard clutched limply at her side. She didn't look entitled or smug. She looked utterly defeated, broken. When the beam of my flashlight hit her, she didn't flinch. She just whispered, her voice fragile, cracked. I wanted it to be mine, just once, to feel like I had control. I stood there for a long moment, then slowly lowered the light. Karen, I said softly, it was never yours to take, and it never will be, but you could have had something better, respect, neighbors, friends. Instead, you torched all of it. She didn't answer. She just turned and walked out the gate, disappearing into the dark. The next morning, the signs were gone. The flyers vanished. The whispers quieted. Karen retreated into her house, blinds drawn, her empire of entitlement reduced to ashes along with her garage. The neighborhood moved on, almost relieved, like a storm had finally passed. Ben came by that weekend, leaning against the porch railing with a beer. So, he said, a quiet triumph in his voice, looks like you won. I shook my head, a profound weariness settling over me. No one wins in a war with Karen, Ben. You just survive long enough for her to burn herself down. He chuckled, raising his bottle in a mock toast to survival.